Greetings everyone, this is Dr. Ellen-Rae bringing you the second video in a series of videos entitled Filipinx Diaspora Decolonization Process. Today we are featuring Josephine Ong, she, her, hers, an upper-class Chinita settler who grew up in Guåhan and currently occupies Gabrielino Tongva land in what is now known as Los Angeles. As an MA student in Asian American Studies, Josephine is working on a project that contextualizes Apolinario Mabini's incarceration in Guåhan from 1901 to 1903 under the system of Asian settler colonialism. She previously worked with independent Guåhan on a teach-in connecting Filipino revolutionary histories to Chamorro sovereignty struggles. So without further ado, let's begin.
Hey, is my video working?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Josephine. I'm a Chinese Filipino settler in Guåhan. I'm currently an Asian American Studies master's student at UCLA. A lot of the work I've been doing in both my research and activism is centered around what it means to be a Filipino settler and what it means for me to try to work in solidarity with Chamorros, whatever that looks like. And I think this is something to do with people's different positionalities. So I am completely clear that I'm upper class Chinese Filipino migrant and that my perspectives are my own and it's shaped by community, but it's still my own perspectives that come from my positionality. So as I go throughout this presentation, I want people to keep that in mind, that this is my perspective, what I've done through my own critical learning process with community, but at the same time, it's not the end all. The title of this talk I wanted to present here is Building Solidarity Between Filipinos and Chamorros in Guåhan. And I wanted to first talk about Filipinx migration to Guåhan. And I purposely use the word Guåhan because I want to use like Chamorro words for what native land is. And to be honest, like Guåhan and Chamorro means we have. And I think that the English term Guam doesn't really capture what it means for Guåhan to be native land and have that like native ways of knowing behind it. So I purposely will use Guåhan throughout this talk. So first I want to begin with how Filipinx migration to Guåhan actually started and how it's evolved into what it is today, so we can really talk more about what it means to organize in this current context with the US military buildup, North Korea, and all those like intense stuff happening. So really brief history. Before, I don't think many people know this actually, but before Spanish colonization, Filipinos and Chamorros actually traded with each other, actually had similar ancestries, and were not that far from each other, so they actually had a more mutually beneficial relationship before Spanish colonization. And it was during Spanish colonization that Filipinos who were colonized by the Spanish at the same time as people, what Chamorros were, they were actually brought to Guåhan to help like pacify Chamorros. So they were like missionaries like Pedro Colón Sud, who became a saint after Chamorros killed him when he was brought to Guåhan. And they were part of the Spanish military, so there was a lot of fighting that went on. A lot of Chamorros died because of this, and Filipinos helped contribute to that, but a lot of them were either conscripted or coerced into this. Mm-hmm. So this began the pitting of Filipinos against Chamorros. It was very early, since like Spanish and then colonization happened in both places. In the 1800s, they started bringing in Filipino criminals, and when Americans took Guåhan in 1898 with the Treaty of Paris, they started bringing in war exiles like Mabini, who was incarcerated in Guåhan from 1901 to 1903. My current research is actually about Mabini's incarceration and the recent community pushbacks against the memorial in Assam. So we'll be talking more about that some other time. But basically, I'm going to move straight into World War II, or post-World War II. I think I'm not sure a lot of people know that Guåhan was actually bombed before Pearl Harbor was, December 7, 1941. Guåhan was occupied by the Japanese military until 1944, when supposedly the Americans liberated Guåhan. But actually what happened is that a lot of land was taken because Chamorros were displaced from land from Japanese occupation, and they were routed into concentration camps like Menengen. So like Guam was really damaged, and a lot of Chamorro land was taken. or like sold at incredibly cheap prices. So to help rebuild the US military presence in Guåhan, they needed a cheap labor force. And because the US Navy believed that Chamorros were unproductive and that Filipinos were actually hard workers, they brought in Filipinos to be used as cheap labor forces to actually build most of the bases in what they are today. So I just want to show that like Filipinos came because they were looking for a better life, more like, you know, the remittance economy of like sending money back home. But at the same time, they contributed to the rebuilding of US military presence in Guåhan to the point where it's like 1/3 of Guåhan's land today. And we'll talk more about that later. But for now, Camp Rojas migrations have led to, Camp Rojas is one of the camps for that Filipino laborers were brought to. A lot of people who are second generation, third generation today were from, their parents were from Camp Rojas, and a couple of people who participate in Independent Guåhan teach-in about Filipino revolutionary histories that their grandparents came from Camp Rojas as well. So I wanted to contextualize this history because a lot of Filipino Americans in Guåhan today have come from this. So tensions between Filipinos and Chamorros really increased around this time because of the mass migration, but it also led to those tensions kind of decreased over time, but I would argue that it's more subtle now, but it's still there as Filipinos continue to work in like the hotel and construction industry. So that's tourism and all that stuff. So today, the US military is going to be happening sometime later this year. The H2 visas, which are visas for temporary visas for non-agricultural workers, was previously revoked. So a lot of Filipinos lost their visas. A lot of people were deported, and it reduced the total amount of foreign workers in Guåhan. But in December 2017, President Trump signed a bill that actually enabled 4,000 H2 workers to come. So this is like the same process of like Filipinos being brought in to work as a cheap labor force to build up US military presence. And now we have the Dave Davis case, which is similar to Rice versus Cayetano, about like building up opening up a decolonization plebiscite, which is basically like the right to vote for Guam status to non-native inhabitants. And I think this violates the UN's principles for decolonization, where you're supposed to have only indigenous people voting for the political status of a colony, because it doesn't really respect the histories of displacement of like Chamorros from their native land. And from my perspective, Filipinos have settled into Guåhan, so they don't have that same ancestral connection and that same history of displacement. Like they've been displaced from the Philippines, so they should respect what it means to be like for Chamorros to have gone through the same process. And we talk more about this during the teach-in, but I think I want to go into the other part because we only have a limited amount of time. So I want to talk about my own organizing perspectives, like what it means, like my perspective as a Chinese Filipino scholar activist, what it means for me to be part of these spaces and to organize against Filipino exarchalism, or what it means to be like someone who moved to native land and who has benefited from like the extraction of native land and resources. So I want to talk briefly about why, in my perspective, should Filipinos work in solidarity with Chamorros. To me, Filipinos have constantly been pitted against Chamorros. There was a lot of anti-Filipino sentiments during the Camp Rojas era that led to a lot of like tensions. Some of them like have persisted to this day, like the whole like thing about like Filipino and Chamorro gangs fighting against each other. And how I think there's still an idea of Filipinos as a source of cheap labor and having to get these difficult, low-paying jobs. But to me, Filipinos are more than just a cheap labor source. Filipinos shouldn't be seen this way, and Filipinos shouldn't be treated this way. Filipinos deserve to have a better life. And I think that just because there's this narrative of Filipinos being hard workers doesn't mean that Filipinos should be put through difficult working conditions and have to work multiple jobs. And I think that like it is like this specific industry that like creates a need for like cheap labor source to extract from native people that sets up a situation for Filipinos this way. So I also wanted to talk about the cost of US militarization. This map is showing the military land takings, and I have these questions for people to think more about. The red is the U.S. military land takings in Guåhan. So the first question is, what are your observations? What does this map show? What does this map make you feel? And what do you think will happen to this map after the U.S. military buildup? So, Ellen, if it's okay, I want to leave people like 30 seconds to look at this map.
Sure.
Okay, I think that's, I hope that was okay. But,
yeah, totally.
So as you can see, there's been a lot of land taking, and with the U.S. military buildup coming and the Marine base being moved from Okinawa to Guåhan, there's going to be a lot more land taking. The government says that they're going to only go within these red spaces, but with the amount of people they're coming, it's bound to spill over. And even with the current struggle around the teach-in, and I think it should be around here, but basically it's a cultural and ancestral site that the U.S. military is planning to put a firing range in, and it's technically supposed to be a nationally protected park, and the military is saying that they're going to take and use that. So I wouldn't believe those narratives that's only going to be within the land. I think it's going to be more. So to already have to live around this presence in your daily life is a lot to deal with. So I want to talk about how this seems pretty intense, but it's possible to overcome these challenges. And I really want to emphasize the importance of community, and it's important for Filipinos to work with each other and support each other. And when you learn about stuff what it means, the impacts of Filipino migration to Guåhan, because I think Filipinos talk a lot about their migration experiences, but in Guåhan, without talking about the effects Filipinos have had on Chamorros and other people living in Guåhan, what Filipinos have done to native land, for example here in this map. I don't know how to, oops. But basically the whole village of Derive is now a Filipino community created that village based on a previous native community, and kind of just created their own thing from Camp Rojas. So this creation of a Filipino settler community, that's a pretty big part of Guåhan, but what are the effects of that? Are creating a community for ourselves, for resistance, but at the same time for what has that done to Chamorros, who originally whose ancestral homeland we also occupy. So I also want to be clear. Okay, so I know Jima's going to talk about this more, so I don't want to get into it in too much detail, but when for me, it's important to work with other Filipinos when you learn about this stuff and when you want to do stuff, because it seems so intense and overwhelming. But when you work with other people, especially if you're Pinay and you're working with other Pinays, it really helps you really transform and feel empowered to do things and go against systems that seem so historical, because as of late out, Filipinos have been pitted against Chamorros since the 1700s. And a mentor once told me, don't beat yourself up if things don't change overnight, because you're working with a 100-year-old system. So when I was with the other Pinays who helped with the teach-in, it really helped me see that it's so great to have Pinays work with each other and to be the one speaking out against things. It's so much better when you do it with other folks, and it enriches your perspective in very rewarding ways. But I want to be clear that in my own learning process, I have a different positionality from most Filipinx migrants. I am upper class and Chinese Filipina, so I have a lot of class and educational privileges. I've also benefited directly from the construction industry in different ways than most Filipinos, because I have never had to do manual labor in my life. I've always benefited from the economic profits my parents have gotten from working with the military. And so I've benefited from indigenous dispossession and very clearly defined and very in ways where I got a lot of the profits, not most Filipino construction workers or HC workers who don't get as much profits as the people who actually own the construction companies that recruit them. So my migration experience is different. in that respect, and I want to be completely clear about that. I also, when I started learning about Filipino sarcosm, was actually like, sadly enough, when I left Guam. Sometimes you have to leave a place and experience dislocation and like trauma and what it means to miss home and like and not be completely comfortable. Sometimes like leaving home helps you realize things because you're so uncomfortable in the place that you've been to, and like the discomfort is like helps you learn through things. And like for me, it was when I went to Tufts University in Boston that I started thinking more about race. And after I learned about stuff from like an ethnic studies perspective, I started asking, what about Guåhan? Because it was all about the continent. So I started reading Keith Camacho's work and Vince Diaz's work, and I got introduced to this idea of Filipino sarcosm from Vince Diaz's Bye Bye Miss American Pie, which was presented at a Filipino community meeting, I think. So after that, I began to read more of the literature, and I worked with Filipino activist groups in the continent. And so like while I was learning, I was also working with activists, including Filipino migrants, and seeing that like the situation that I was that I didn't really know much as like an upper class person, and that working with community helped me realize that like my Filipino settlers are being like abused by the system that sees them as a cheap labor source, and that like we need to combat that together, both through theory and through activism. So when I returned to Guåhan after graduation and before I entered the UCLA Asian American Studies department, I worked with independent Guåhan on this teach-in that I think Jamal will talk more about, but basically that teaching came from our discussions with Chamorro activists about why we thought it was important to connect Filipinos' own history of decolonization and like current decolonization struggles to that of Chamorro, so that we could create this the building of solidarity. So as someone that helped to do this organizing, my thought process coming into it was that I've also been hurt by dispossession of Chamorros from their lands. I have benefited materially more than I think most Filipinos, but I've also had to deal with the militarization of Guåhan. Like I grew up with tanks crossing the road, and all I could think about was, oh my God, I'm going to be late for school. Like most people don't think that after seeing 20 army tanks. And this stuff about North Korea, the threat, I think that the traumas of being targeted and caught up in wars between foreign powers like China, North Korea, and the United States creates feelings of fear and anxiety just by living in Guam that I think no one should have to experience. I think that it's because of the U.S. military presence in Guåhan that we got caught up in this, and that no one should have to experience that. I also think that it's important for me to address my own complicity. I've benefited from Filipino sarcosm in a lot of ways, especially like when it comes to economic profits. And to me, I want to be able to better improve myself and like my own relationships with Chamorros and Guåhan. And that's why I advocate and support independent Guåhan, because I think that I won't have to deal with like the militarization of Guåhan's land. And by addressing my complicity, I will also address my own traumas from supporting the militarization and taking of Chamorro land. I think it's all very connected, that our traumas and our liberation is all tied with each other. So to support Chamorro liberation, to me, is to support my own liberation and that of the greater Filipino community in the ways that we're all connected in this like colonial system of like U.S. military occupation of Guåhan. So I've also uploaded or written down a few community questions. I've had this in mind in conversations with Chamorro and Filipino activists, so I wanted to put it out there for people to think about, and I'm going to put up my email at the end of this talk so people can email me their ideas, because it's a community in there and it's not just my questions, and I'd love to hear people's answers and thoughts. So the first question is, what do Filipinos know about their own situation in Guåhan? This is addressed to Filipinos in Guåhan. What is it like to live as a Filipino in Guåhan right now? How can we as the Filipinx community in Guåhan build from what we know of our own situation to work in solidarity with Chamorro activists? What do we think solidarity with Chamorro activists look like? And how can we create more spaces for Filipinos and Chamorros to talk and work with each other? Not only just to talk, I think, but to act. And like, for example, there's a lot of current events around a teach-in, what would it mean for more Filipinos to show up to these events. So I also included some organizations to follow. Feel free to take a screenshot right now, but I've included a couple, including Independent Guåhan, who I work more closely with, who take the teach-in, all these other organizations. And I've included like brief descriptions about them so folks can learn more and like see. And there's you can look up their information online so you can contact them. And if you're interested in supporting, I think it's important to ask these orgs and these community-based groups to ask them what they need and what you can do to support rather than what you think they need to do, because these communities know these community orgs know what they're doing and what they need, and they're doing a lot of great work right now. So besides that, I have a couple of my sources here. And I just want to end with a thanks to everybody for participating, and I look forward to continuing conversations and actions towards decolonization of Guåhan, other parts of the Pacific. I've written down my email in case people need to know. And yeah, feel free to contact me, and thanks for coming.